Dot Pruitt had run the Wagon Wheel Diner across from Hadley's garage for 31 years, and in all that time she had never seen a man in a $1,000 suit so angry at a tarp. Brennan came in fast that Tuesday morning, his car still rocking on its springs from the way he'd swung it into the gravel lot. He'd bought up the feed store, the old laundromat, and the empty lot where the bowling alley used to sit, and every one of those deals had come with a sign and a smile for the local paper. Hadley's garage was the last piece, and it was costing him more in patience than it ever would in dollars. "Friday," he said, rapping his knuckles against the canvas like it owed him money. "That heap goes to the scrapyard by Friday, or the county hauls it off and bills you for the privilege. I've got investor flying in for the groundbreaking, Hadley, and I am not having them drive past a corpse with a sheet over it." Walt Hadley didn't look up from the lift he was working under. He never did. Not for Brennan. He wiped his hands on a rag and said, "It's not going anywhere." "It's been not going anywhere for 14 years, Brennan said. "That's the problem. I bought every other lot on this stretch of Route 9 fair and square, and the only thing standing between me and a ribbon cutting is a dead car in a barn that doesn't even run." Dot watched it all from her window, coffee pot in hand, and thought what most of Larkin Hollow had thought for 14 years, that Walt Hadley was a stubborn man, holding onto a dead thing the way some men held onto a grudge. His daughter Junie came out of the office wiping grease off her hands. 18 now, quiet and watchful like her father. She waited until Brennan's truck pulled away before she said anything. "Dad, if they tow it, that's a fine we can't pay. And it's not even, it doesn't run. It's never run, not since before I can remember." "It ran once," Walt said. "The night before it didn't." That was as close as Walt Hadley ever came to telling the story. And even Dot, who had fed him eggs every morning since his wife passed, only had it in pieces, gathered over 14 years of him saying almost nothing at all. Here was what Dot knew. 14 years ago, on a night when Route 9 turned into a river and half the county lost power, an old silver car had come around the bend too fast, hit standing water, and gone into the ditch behind Walt's garage, hard enough to fold the front end, like paper. Walt had been the only one out in it, checking on a generator, with Junie asleep upstairs over the office, and he'd heard the impact before he saw it, a long, wet shriek of metal swallowed almost instantly by the rain. He'd pulled an old man out of that wreck with his bare hands, working by flashlight, the water already up past his ankles in the ditch. The old man had been small and frail under a soaked wool coat, and Walt had carried him into the garage bay because it was closer than the house, and laid him on a folding cot, and called for an ambulance that took 40 minutes to come because 3 other roads were already underwater. The old man had been dying. Everybody who saw him at the hospital said so. But before the ambulance took him, lying on that cot with rain still running off both of them, and Junie standing wide-eyed in the doorway in her pajamas, he had grabbed Walt's wrist with a grip that surprised everyone, and he had said one thing, over and over, until Walt promised, "Don't let them scrap her. Don't sell her for parts. Don't let the county crush her. Don't let anybody touch her. Someone will come for the comet. Promise me you'll keep her safe until they do." Walt promised. The old man, Elias Calloway, the hospital records said, no listed family, no next of kin anyone could find, died 3 days later. In his coat pocket was a folded note addressed, in shaking handwriting, to whoever finds her. Nobody had ever found anybody to give it to. And in the ambulance bay, before they closed the doors, the old man had pressed something small and cold into 4-year-old Junie's hand, a tiny brass star worn smooth, and told her, for being brave. Junie still wore it on a chain. She'd worn it every day of her life and never once asked her father why. For 14 years, Walt kept that wreck under a tarp in his barn. He patched the barn roof himself, twice, with money that should have gone toward a new water heater rather than let rain get to the car underneath. He turned down 3 offers from a salvage yard in Hagerstown. Good offers, real money, the kind of money that would have meant a better truck, a real vacation, new boots for Junie, that didn't have cardboard in the soles. The 3rd offer came the same winter the garage furnace died, and Walt spent that February running space heaters and wearing 2 coats indoors rather than touch the car. He turned every offer down without explanation, and the town did what towns do. It decided he was sentimental or stubborn, or not quite right, and it moved on. Junie had grown up alongside that tarp the way other kids grew up alongside a swing set. As a little girl, she used to sit on an overturned bucket in the barn doorway and do her homework there, because it was the only quiet place in the building, and her father never once told her to move. She'd dusted the tarp without being asked 100 times over the years, and never once lifted a corner to look underneath. She didn't know why. It had simply always been the one thing in that garage you didn't touch. Thursday afternoon, with one day left on Brennan's deadline, a young woman walked into the wagon wheel and sat at the counter like she'd been driving a long time. "I know this is going to sound strange," she told Dot, "but I'm trying to find out if anyone around here remembers a man named Calloway. Elias Calloway. He would have come through here a long time ago, maybe 14, 15 years, driving a car he built himself. Silver, low to the ground. Handmade." Dot set down the coffee pot slower than she meant to. "Honey," she said, "you're going to want to walk across the street." Her name was Nora Quill, and she worked for an outfit called the Continental Motoring Heritage Trust. And she had spent 3 years chasing a name that, until a county records office digitized 50-year-old death certificates, nobody had been able to find. Elias Calloway, it turned out, had been one of the most important chassis designers of his generation, the kind of man whose ideas ended up, quietly and uncredited, in half the racing cars of his era, until he walked away from the industry in his 60s and vanished. The story among collectors was that he'd spent his last years building one final car, alone, by hand, to prove something only he understood, and then he'd disappeared completely. The car was called, in the one surviving sketch anyone had ever found, the Comet. Chassis number CC1, the only one ever built. "For 30 years, Nora said, standing in Walt's open bay with rain smell still hanging in the air from that morning's storm, people in my world have argued about whether CC1 ever existed at all, or whether it burned in a fire in Ohio, or got crushed for scrap 30 years ago without anyone knowing what it was. I've followed 4 dead ends in 3 states. The death certificate is the only solid thing I've had in 3 years. It listed the town where he died. This town. There was an old man," Walt said. "It wasn't a question. Came through here in a storm. 14 years back." Nora looked at him for a long moment, the way Dot imagined a person looked when 3 years of work suddenly had a face attached to it. "You knew him?" "Knew him for about an hour," Walt said. "That was enough." Walt didn't say anything. He walked to the barn, and Junie and Dot followed, and he pulled back the tarp. Nora Quill went very still. She walked around the wreck slowly, the way Dot imagined a person might walk around something they'd spent their whole career being told didn't exist. She crouched at the front frame rail, brushed away 14 years of dust with her bare hand, and there, stamped into the metal, faint but unmistakable, were 2 letters and a number. "CC1, Mr. Hadley," she said, and her voice had changed completely. "Do you have any idea what's been sitting in this barn?" She opened the glove box. It had stayed shut and dry all those years, the only part of the car the rain had never touched. And inside was a leather folio, water-stained at the edges but intact, hand-drawn engineering sketches, dense columns of numbers in pencil, and a second letter. This one wasn't addressed to whoever finds her. It was addressed to whoever kept their word. Nora read it out loud, because her hands were shaking too much to read it silently. Elias Calloway had written it in the weeks before that storm, knowing his health was failing, knowing he had no one left. If the car survived, he'd written, and if some stranger had been decent enough to keep a dying man's promise instead of cashing it in, then that stranger, and not any museum, not any collector, not any institutions, should be the one the trust answered to. Friday morning, Cole Brennan's flatbed pulled up to Hadley's garage right on schedule, with a tow operator and a county inspector and, Dot suspected, a certain amount of satisfaction. What Brennan found instead was a Continental Motoring Heritage Trust transport vehicle, climate-controlled and gleaming. 2 preservation specialists in white gloves, a reporter from the regional paper that Dot had absolutely called the night before, and about 30 people from town standing in a loose half-circle around the open barn doors, because word travels fast in Larkin Hollow and faster still when Dot Pruitt is the one spreading it. Brennan got out of his truck slowly, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. The tow operator looked at the transport vehicle, then at Brennan, then back at the transport vehicle, and made no move to unhook anything. "What is this?" Brennan said. Nora stepped forward and told him plainly in front of everyone. "CC1, the only surviving prototype built by Elias Calloway. Verified that morning by 2 independent specialists. Preliminary appraisal, pending full restoration, $9.4 million. Dot watched Brennan's face do something she'd waited 14 years to see. He looked at the tarp, now folded back, at the rust and the folded fender, and the faint stamped letters that had been 6 feet from a county tow. Truck's hook for one more day, and the color went out of him. I told him to scrap it, he said, mostly to himself. I told him Friday. Nobody said anything to that. Nobody had to. He got back in his truck without another word, and his crew followed, and that was the last anyone in Larkin Hollow ever saw of the groundbreaking. The Trust's preservation honorarium, the kind of figure that, 14 years ago, would have changed Walt's life completely, and now mostly meant Junie's tuition was paid in full. The roof got properly fixed, and the garage got a sign that didn't need patching every spring. Came with something else, a standing offer for Walt to consult on the comet's restoration, doing exactly what he'd always done, just no longer wondering how to make it through February. It was Nora who noticed the brass star. Junie had it out, turning it over in her fingers the way she always did when she was thinking, and Nora went still for the second time that week. "That's his," she said quietly. "There's a photograph, the only one we have of him as a young man, in his father's shop. He's wearing that exact star, pinned to his coat. It was his father's, a good luck charm. He gave it to me," Junie said, "in the ambulance. He said it was for being brave." Nora looked at her for a long moment. "I think," she said, "he was giving you something that mattered to him more than the car." That summer, the comet went on display. Not finished, not yet. Restoration takes years, and the Trust intended to do it right, but cleaned, stabilized, and set up under proper light at a small regional transportation museum 2 counties over, with a placard that told the whole story. The engineer, the storm, the promise, and the mechanic who kept it for 14 years without telling a soul why. Walt and Junie stood near the front for the unveiling. Both of them in clothes Dot had never seen before, both of them looking faintly uncomfortable about it. Nora stood with them. She'd taken to driving out most weekends through that spring, officially for the restoration paperwork. Though Dot had noticed, she stayed for supper more often than the paperwork strictly required, and that Junie had started saving her the good seat at the counter without being asked. Dot, watching from the back of the room with her arms crossed and her eyes a little wet, didn't think it was only about the car anymore, for either of them. Dot had spent 14 years thinking Walt Hadley was a fool for hanging on to something dead. Standing in that museum, watching him run one careful hand along a fender he'd protected longer than most people keep promises at all, she understood she'd had it backward the whole time. He hadn't been holding on to something dead. He'd been the only one in town who knew it was alive.